Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the exida webathon today. So for our topic, we will be diving into a pragmatic approach for cybersecurity, specifically looking at how asset owners can really leverage and apply the IEC 62443 standard to their applications, and looking at the most effective ways to do that. And so the overarching question that we have that we'll be asking is how can a pragmatic cybersecurity approach be implemented for OT and ICS asset owners? And we'll cover three main parts that build up to answering this question. The first one is, why do we need a pragmatic approach, right? Why is this something that is beneficial for asset owners to consider? What does it mean? What's the background? So we'll cover all of that information first. Next, we'll look at how to actually go through and follow that approach. And we'll highlight roadmaps and why they can be so important from a cybersecurity perspective in terms of really building and implementing a program. And then lastly, we'll try to understand and break down what are the benefits of following this type of approach, or a pragmatic approach, as we call it. So to get started, it's helpful to really understand the current situation for industrial control systems. And the reality today is that just really the vast majorities of these are currently very vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. And so some studies that were done between 2017 and 2019 showed that of the industrial control systems in those studies, 90% of them experience a cyber attack within that 2-year window. So it's something where it's not just that the biggest companies that are being targeted, it really is impacting the vast majority of companies have seen some sort of cybersecurity incident. Additionally, we're seeing that the number of hacking tools specific to OT or industrial control systems is increasing quite significantly. And one of the places that we have really seen this the most is the use of ransomware as a service, where skilled attackers may develop targeted ransomware types attacks, but then these can be widely deployed by many different groups to many different organizations. And an interesting statistic that I saw was that in 2022, there is an 87% year-over-year increase in the amount of ransomware attacks impacting industrial control systems in industrial facilities. And so that number jumped up all the way to 605 incidents in 2022. So this is something that, it's not just the sophisticated attacks that can have a very real impact on safety and control, but there are also a high number of attacks that are just leading to downtime business losses. And so we have to think about how we protect against those various ranges of attacks or those different types of attacks for our critical systems. Another piece that we need to look at is really understanding the remote access and the exposure to many of today's industrial control systems. And back in 2020, in the earlier stages of the pandemics, some reviews of this showed that up to 70% of control systems had now allowed remote access as a requirement to continue operation. And so if we think about it, the amount of attacks we're seeing increases, we're seeing more readily available malware, and we're also seeing increased remote connection. So all of that is really increasing the exposure of these industrial systems. And then if we think about the actual environment of these systems, the types of devices that they have, the upgrade frequency typically being closer to, say, a 15-year turnaround as opposed to, say, 3 to 5 years for Windows devices. We're seeing lots of legacy equipment that really has limited protection against cybersecurity attacks. And so having unsecure devices and increased vulnerabilities for those OT devices further increases the exposure of these industrial systems. And so when we look at, let's say, all of that background of the current situations and some of the challenges that are facing these control systems, we also have to think about what forces are influencing how they adopt and how they try to implement cybersecurity. And so we'll talk about four of those main drivers or those main forces that play a role in cybersecurity implementation. So the first is national standards and regulations. And so this is, specific government requirements in different regions, different countries, and it's also something that can vary quite a bit depending on the region. For example, in the UK, the Health and Safety Executive is driving cybersecurity implementation for critical infrastructure, pretty hard for sites with coma scenarios or that could result in loss of essential services. They are conducting audits and helping build remediation plans as we speak, really driving companies to follow OG86 as an example, making sure that they've done cybersecurity risk assessment and having the potential for fines or regulatory action if those steps aren't being taken in an acceptable time frame. And it's certainly not just the UK. For the European Union, the NIS2 directive has been recently updated, and so that's having a major impact on how cybersecurity is being implemented. In Australia, the Security of Critical Infrastructure, or SOCI Act, is having a major impact on critical infrastructure targets there. In the US, we've got some industry-specific regulations looking at the TSA security directives that have come out in recent years. And so we can see that for each country, there are different standards and regulations that really have to be looked at and understood that may play a role on how that company chooses to implement cybersecurity. Next, we can look at the potential insurance requirements. And this is something that we're seeing particularly in the United States. But cybersecurity insurance has become really an increasingly hot topic, both in terms of organizations looking to get coverage, as well as working on understanding what it is that has to be in place in order for an organization to get a policy and what the insurers are actually coming in and auditing for or looking for to make that determination of whether or not a company can be given a policy, because they're trying to understand their risk. And so if they give a policy that covers for a ransomware attack, for example, and the site is not well protected and their chances of experiencing a ransomware attack are pretty high each year, that's going to be a bad return for the insurance company. So they actually have very specific questions, very specific things that they're looking for when making that decision to offer a policy or not. And we've even seen some instances where the insurer may ask a company to fill out a survey or provide information about their current protections. And if the person filling that out really isn't familiar with what the questions are asking, doesn't know how well those controls are being implemented for their site, it's actually possible that the policy may be voided if, for example, you claim that you have effective cybersecurity monitoring. If that monitoring doesn't apply to, let's say, different parts of the system, and you have a significant incident that wasn't caught because it wasn't implemented fully or wasn't implemented for that area. So that's something that companies, as they answer that question of what sort of cyber security insurance do they want or need to be aware of, and that can have a major role in impacting how they adopt cybersecurity. The next one that we can look at are our industry standards or our international guidelines that provide some recommendations and best practices on how to implement cybersecurity. And so here, the IEC 62443 standard is really what we're seeing being broadly adopted in many different regions and many different industries. And this gives that defensible set of best practices that identifies requirements for different stakeholders in the industrial cybersecurity space, and also can be used to really build out a full cybersecurity lifecycle. So we're seeing that have a major impact on how companies are implementing cybersecurity. Certainly, that's not the only standard that's being looked at. There are a number of other best practices, such as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or NIST 882, that are also playing a role in shaping this. But really, for industrial systems, we're seeing IEC 62443 really be that gold standard. In addition to the cybersecurity standards, it's also important to realize that cybersecurity is being highlighted in safety standards as well. So the 2016 release of the IEC 61511 standard included specific requirements around doing cybersecurity risk assessments for the SIS and connected systems. So if a manufacturer is providing either a configurable component that's going to be used in a 61511 safety system, or people who are providing a, let's say, certified system or a certified site that includes a number of safety functions, there are now specific requirements to doing a cybersecurity risk assessment as part of that. And we're also seeing other industries follow suit. So it's not just the process safety industry, but newer updates to machine safety standards, as well as updates to the machinery directive, also now include some cybersecurity considerations as well. And so that's going to have a major impact on those, the machine industry, as well as other associated industries. And then lastly, when we look at the stakeholder expectations, this is something where it's not just external drivers that are really shaping how companies look at this, but also the individuals within that organization. Even a question as simple as who really has ownership of a cybersecurity risk can lead to some very interesting conversations. Is that the ultimate responsibility of a chief information officer or a chief information security officer or CISO? Or is it something that's really owned by the plant manager or the engineering manager? And as you look at all of the different roles who are involved in cybersecurity, it's important to understand what your specific responsibilities might be, or what role your organization is expecting you to take there. And this is particularly important when we think about the potential for significant downtime or safety impact from an attack on industrial control systems. But if you're a process safety engineer who's counting on an SIS to work and that SIS is compromised, what sort of responsibility do you have to have asked those questions and make sure that that system is designed properly? If it's your control system that you're responsible for, what are you doing to really make sure that that risk is managed? And so that's something that has to be thought about from the individual stakeholders as well, because all of those will drive the way in which companies look at and approach their facility risk management. And so now that we have a little bit of context on what's the current situation, what's driving and really leading to our current cybersecurity landscape, the next question is, well, where does this pragmatic approach come in? And so we can start by talking about what even is a pragmatic approach. What does the word pragmatic mean? And so the dictionary definition is dealing with things sensibly and realistically, and in a way that is based on practical rather than theoretical consideration. And so in general, we can think, well, we always want to be sensible. We always want to be realistic. So what does that really mean from a cybersecurity context? And I think what's interesting is if we look at the definition of pragmatics as far as a field of study, this is more about linguistics and language study. But what's really interesting is it looks at how context contributes to the meaning. And I wanted to include this as well because this context or understanding, let's say, what a cybersecurity vulnerability means, depending on what device it's impacted, depending on what the risk could ultimately be. That context really is everything for industrial control system cybersecurity. And we'll see how the potential impacts it could have is really what's going to have to drive us to make sensible choices and be realistic about what actions we can take and in what time frame. And so if we look at why a pragmatic approach is needed, there's kind of a couple of just core facts that lead into building this view of the industrial control system space. So the first is industrial companies are facing an increasing number of credible cybersecurity threats. So with more remote access, with more ransomware and other types of malware really being prepackaged for industrial control systems, with more companies experiencing more threats from more bad actors, we can see a lot of different reasons why this exposure and the number of threats that companies are facing is growing. So we've got a difficult problem to solve and a complex problem to solve as well. So that's our first tenet. Our next is we don't have an infinite amount of resources to address these threats. Companies still have to make sure that they're able to operate. They have to balance security objectives with operations objectives, and have limited financial resources to apply to these. And so we can't just take everything we have and throw it at those threats and expect that to really give us a good result. And so because of that scarcity of resources, we have to be realistic. We have to understand what our current risk is. We have to really know that, and then take sensible steps to reduce that risk. We've got to understand we're not going to get there overnight. We have to understand that it may take time. It may take a series of steps and programs to really build in and ramp us up from where a lot of organizations in the industry currently are, to where they need to be to have a defensible position. But we've got to understand that journey, and take it one step at a time. And so that's where, when we look at the exida approach, this is something that even from our first book on industrial cybersecurity that we published over 5 years ago now, it really comes down to following that pragmatic approach, and understanding how we can leverage the standards and leverage all of those industry best practices and guidance, and really take it and apply it to a site in a way that's going to be most beneficial for them. And that's a key. And so one of the ways we can do that is taking advantage of existing industry standards and best practices. And so for the ISA IEC 62443 standards, we can look at how different standards apply to different stakeholders. And so for product suppliers, they really need to be focused on the 4-1 and 4-2 portions of the standards. For system integrators, the 2-4 and 3-2 portions identify the steps with which they would integrate and implement a system, as well as the risk assessment portion. And then for the asset owner, there are procedural requirements in 2-1 about how to operate and maintain that system over time. But they also need to think about how the system integrator is building that system, what sort of system security requirements do they need to meet, and what should they be asking for vendors and equipment suppliers. So although the asset owner is only directly responsible for this top portion of the standard, they really need to understand what other organizations are supplying as well. And we'll talk about how by leveraging the requirements of these standards, asset owners can have a better understanding or a better perspective of what's being provided. And so that's where cases where an asset owner may ask a system integrator to have either a certified process or certified system, that can help the asset owner as they go about implementing their approach and designing their security policies in their system. And so when we look at the effective implementation from the asset owner side, generally we recommend starting with a benchmark study to really understand where it is you're starting from, and analyzing risks for that same reason as well, to understand what's currently in place and also where your highest risk and exposure is. So what are the areas that you need to focus on first? Once you have that understanding of the current state, building a roadmap or putting together the specific plan of each individual step and plan timeframes can help to stay on target and really drive that growth. From there, it's important to have a cybersecurity management plan, or an overall system. And we really highlight it being OT specific because although there's a lot of great things that we can leverage from the IT side, because the risk is on the OT systems, there needs to be an OT specific understanding and also OT ownership. And so these OT procedures may sit under the overall IT umbrella. They may be managed by a group that's led by IT. But it's important that we really make sure that there is information specific to OT systems, and the approach required for OT environments, as part of that cybersecurity management plan. We can look at embedding cybersecurity into the project lifecycle and the design of the system. So specifying the right requirements, making sure that whether it's a security level target or a specific set of requirements that the vendor needs to meet, that's defined and that's used as a part of implementing future systems or upgrading existing systems. And then lastly, we can think about how we roll out and maintain both that program and also the overall security of the industrial control systems over time. And we'll talk about some specific recommendations for each of those areas. So in terms of a benchmark assessment, there are a lot of different terms with somewhat similar meanings, but they tend to be thrown around in the security world. So, for example, what's the difference between a gap assessment and a vulnerability assessment versus a risk assessment? So typically gap assessments focus a bit more on the policy and procedure aspects, whereas a vulnerability and risk assessment, in vulnerability assessment, you're looking at specific holes in the system. And in a risk assessment, you're looking, as those holes as part of it, but also looking at the likelihood and the consequence. And so what we'll recommend is kind of splitting that perspective and understanding that the benchmark may be done to really understand the procedural aspects and where your overall organization or your approach has holes, and the cybersecurity risk assessment may be paired with a vulnerability assessment to really understand what the system-specific vulnerabilities and exposures are, as well as what the system-specific risks are. And so ultimately, when we follow that type of approach, we want to understand where our current exposure is and also understand how mature we are as an organization. And if we include the stakeholders as part of these benchmark analysis and risk assessments, we can really help to build buy-in over time, show them the specific considerations that they're going to be responsible for, show them the risks that are currently in place and what it will really take to address those, and help to build that plan over time. And so, for example, for our benchmark, we may pick a standard such as 62443-2-1, and really look at the procedural aspects of how are our current procedures and practices lining up with what we need to do to be having an effective program. And that'll help us really understand, do we have weaknesses through our people? Do we have weaknesses in our overall method? And things that we're going to have to globally address. Whereas for the risk assessment, as a specific example, this is now looking at the likelihood of cybersecurity incidents. It's looking at how significant those incidents would be if they occurred, and the potential outcomes of that in terms of the risk and any risk mitigation actions that are required, as well as existing or planned countermeasures that are credited with reducing that likelihood. And so the cyber risk assessment, sometimes called a cyber PHA or cyber HAZOP, is really a robust method for getting that understanding and finding out what the highest risk scenarios are, what the highest risk facilities or parts of the organization are, and then focusing resources there and taking the right steps to reduce that risk moving forward. So having both that procedural view and also that system risk specific view is really important for knowing where a company is. And so once we have that information, then we can really look at building a roadmap together. And the roadmap is not something that is going to be the same for every organization, but there are some typical steps that we see along the way. So first, we need to have competency. If we don't have competent people, if we don't have training plans in place, we're not going to build the skills necessary to tackle these challenges. Cybersecurity is a complex field, and then when we overlay that with the complexity of industrial control systems and the potential process safety impacts, we really do have a lot that we need to understand or train people on in order for them to understand and help manage those risks. So building competency is often a required initial step. Then we can look at assessing gaps through benchmark studies and assessing our current risks through cybersecurity risk assessment. We can look to create the cybersecurity management system with an OT focus, and then develop and roll that out to our different sites, to our different parts of the organization, and then track performance over time. And so although the specific steps or the time frame and the way in which we do this may change, in general, we'll have to cover many of these steps to build a successful cybersecurity program. for an OT or ICS organization. And so if we look at the next step there about how we can look at building a cybersecurity management system, as we've gone through and done benchmark studies, we've seen a lot of common gaps. Some are as simple as not really having the right documentation in place or not defining it clearly. And so in general, we can build out those through a top-level cybersecurity management system document where we have the process. We have the ownership within the organization, the life cycle, and who is the owner for each of those life cycle steps within a project. And so by doing that, we can really help to improve that communication, that definition of responsibilities. Then when it comes to things like the repeatability or understanding risk and defining those specific cybersecurity requirements, having standards and procedures for each of those lifecycle tasks underneath that top level procedure then helps to build out that program and really show exactly what's needed to, let's say, meet the requirements of IEC 62443. Or, not just the standard requirements, but also looking at regulatory requirements within the region and saying, how are we going to not only meet those, but also meet best practices as well? Or how can we leverage existing best practices and procedures in order to demonstrate that we're meeting our regulatory requirements? And so for that top level document, we can think about having the overall scope, defining how it's managed within the organization, looking at how we're going to train and develop competency within our staff. We can have specific requirements for competency built in. We can look at maintaining and managing our compliance to the requirements of our internal policies and procedures through periodic audits, through a continuous improvement process to grow and build that program over time. And for the top level CSMS, we're not going to define all of the lifecycle steps or exactly what has to be done for each of those lifecycle steps. But we will outline that a cybersecurity lifecycle approach is followed and identify and provide references to those specific procedures that give more guidance, more details on that top level policy. And so for those, we'll really drive through the cybersecurity lifecycle that's outlined in 62443 and think about everything we need to do from the assessment phase, like the cybersecurity risk assessments that we talked about, identifying the critical assets, through the implementation and design phase where we are applying countermeasures, adding protections into our systems, specifying those requirements to vendors and equipment suppliers, and then testing them during the cyber portions of FAT and SAT. Then we can look at the maintain phase of once the system's implemented or once our upgrade is completed, what is it going to take on an ongoing basis to maintain the security of that system? And so all three of those areas really need to be looked at and considered when implementing the program. And then lastly, we can look at, as we build out those procedures, having a good starting point is something that can certainly help increase the speed of deployment, make sure that the relevant standard requirements are met, and also look to embed and use additional industry best practices. And so this is something where for both that top level CSMS and a lot of the critical procedures in the lifecycle task, we've actually developed templates that we use internally when we're writing and developing cybersecurity procedures, as well as templates that can be purchased by our customers if they want to use those as a starting point. So that's just one example of something that can be done to help kickstart the CSMS or that portion of the roadmap. And one template that I want to just take a quick look at is the cybersecurity requirement specification. And when we talk about embedding cybersecurity requirements into your project lifecycle or building that in as part of your system specification, using a document like this where the security level requirements or the targets that need to be met, the specific description and understanding of the system and how it should be designed and how it should be implemented, Having this all in one document can be very helpful. It can be used for, requesting vendor scopes, can be used as, test case requirements and be the start of what you're going to build into, let's say, a CFAT and CSAT procedures. And so having this is one really good way to embed those requirements that come out of your cyber risk assessment into projects and into future steps that will be taken. And so then when we think about the rollout for a cybersecurity program and our specific countermeasures or mitigation actions that we're going to take, it's important to go back to that pragmatic approach, right? And having the roadmap and understanding how you roll that out is really key. And so the first one is we've got to be realistic on our goals and deadlines. And I've seen it very many times where companies have an assessment, they realize that where they're starting from a cyber posture is maybe not where they hoped to or expected to be. And as an outcome of that, they've got, hundreds of recommendations, hundreds of actions, and they're trying to get everything done in, a week or a month. And a lot of times we don't build in the time or the resources that are really needed to put in the work and get these policy set up or to make the organizational changes or the implementation of the right controls. And so understanding that this is a process that takes time is critical. So that's something that is really important for goal and timing setting. The next thing is we've got to be sensible in our approach. It's not possible to deploy cyber countermeasures to 100 sites simultaneously, or even if we only have 10 sites, we should really be focusing on the highest risk site first. Or if we only have one site, but we have multiple areas in it, we should focus on what are the most critical areas first. And so using the results of that risk assessment to know what are the most important controls to apply, knowing what are the areas where they're most needed, can help us focus that effort and start with pilot sites. Once we work out the kinks and understand any of the specific challenges that we're going to face, we can then deploy it more effectively at other sites. And we can also talk about what I call the bang for buck improvements or the low hanging fruit, where based on the risk assessments, a lot of times we'll see there are going to be specific threat scenarios, whether it's an internal disgruntled employee or let's say remote access that's not well controlled for legacy accounts. And we're going to see that for each of our different zones or a lot of our different systems, those same threats or those same causes are leading a lot of our high risk scenarios. And so if we identify that and we can address those areas first by implementing countermeasures that knock out a lot of our risk, that are easier to do, we should always start with that and take the simple steps that we can to reduce the risk now, and then look at having a continuous improvement approach for more invasive countermeasures that may have a potential impact on availability or may require system downtime to implement. So we can always think about what can we do now to reduce the risk, and then what's our plan for implementing additional controls that are required over time. And so the idea is, even if we picture industrial cybersecurity as this big boulder, we've got this big challenge or big gap that we're trying to address. It's not realistic to have one person pick up that entire load or one person tackle that entire area. We should make sure that the right team is a place, that we've built that buy-in with the key stakeholders, and then it really is incremental steps. And as we start to get that ball rolling, and then we get pilot sites done, we see improvements, we see benefits, then it'll really help other sites gain momentum and be able to more effectively roll out and follow those requirements as well. So as we build that momentum, we can really see more changes and faster improvements. In terms of benefits of this approach, I mean, the first one is quite simply, we need to focus our resources where they provide the most benefit. So we've got lots of threats that we need to be aware of and consider, but we only have limited resources to address them. So we have to understand the specific scenarios that are most critical. What are the first steps we need to take, and how do we plan out additional mitigation? We want to start with our highest risks first. and make sure that we are buying down that risk before we go to address lower risk or less critical scenarios. Like I mentioned, if we build that organizational support and that incremental progress over time, we'll get the culture, we'll get the momentum that we need to make significant strides. And we've worked with companies, we've seen customers go from being very immature from a cybersecurity standpoint to very mature, and again, faster than they may have originally thought, but it's still a process. It still takes time. And it's only by doing those small steps up front and building that culture that you're then able to make more progress later on. And that all falls back into the strategy of what do you prioritize first and how do you roll out that program. But by following a pragmatic approach, by building that roadmap, you can really make sure that you're getting the most out of a security program and really maximizing that benefit. And so with that in mind, part of the pragmatic approach is, there's no goal or no objective that's too small, because each of those simple steps is going to help build the foundation for better cybersecurity over time. And so if you're sitting here listening to this presentation and thinking, oh my gosh, we've got an industrial site or a product in industrial systems, and we've been so focused on safety and operations that we haven't really dug into the cybersecurity yet. We haven't seen that as a main issue or area of focus for us. I'd say, hey, start with training. Figure out who members in the organization who are going to be responsible for these activities are, and put them through either a certificate or a certification program. Have them take relevant courses, because that's going to help them, have the skills and the tools needed to really go through and take some of those other steps. So that can be a great opportunity to, build competency either as an individual or within your organization to be able to tackle these types of challenges. If it's something where you've taken some steps in the past, you have some training in place, but you don't know exactly where you are as an organization or exactly where a system is, whether it's high risk or not. Starting with a gap or a benchmark assessment and a risk assessment, that can really help to show where is the exposure, where's the risk, and what is really required to close those gaps. And using that as a start to identify your roadmap and where you go from understanding your base case. And then for the last one, maybe you've already had 3 gap assessments. You know that you're weak on policies and procedures. You don't want another one. You need to jump into it and get started. Well, we know that cybersecurity management and having it well defined is something that every organization is going to need. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You've got to have a cybersecurity management system in place to really drive and ensure that you're following the right steps, going through the life cycle effectively. And so sometimes some organizations like to just jump in and start working on that cybersecurity management system. And certainly that's an option, whether you start updating existing procedures or you leverage templates. That's going to be a key part of the roadmap. And so regardless of where your organization is, nearly every organization can take one of those 3 steps or one of those options for a first goal and start to make progress on improving their understanding or their readiness to address cybersecurity issues. And so the last part that I like to end with is a Thomas Edison quote, and it's, "There's no substitute for hard work." And I think this is particularly true for cybersecurity as it is for things in general. It's really not an area where there are shortcuts, right? There's no single bullet or single project or program where if you do just that one thing, you're going to address the entire complex issue of industrial control systems and have a perfectly functional operating record without any disruptions or any potential concerns down the road. So this is not to pitch and say, oh, if you just say you're taking a pragmatic approach, it'll solve all your problems. But when we do that hard work, we want to make sure we're spending it in the right places. And so by having a proven methodology for taking sensible steps to make realistic improvements over time, understanding what resources you have, understanding where your highest risks are first, and addressing those can make sure that that hard work, that energy for the organization, that the resources that are applied to this are spent in the most important areas. And this is the key where, if you follow that step-by-step approach or that roadmap approach, it's something where it may start with one individual or one owner within the organization who recognizes this, whether they're a controls engineer or process safety engineer, former IT personnel who have been moved over to the OT side and start to see these gaps. It can give a roadmap for that one person to start to build the organizational movement and really have their hard work and the hard work of everyone around them turn into meaningful organizational improvement and cybersecurity gains. And so it's not a substitute for the hard work, but having that pragmatic approach really helps you get the most out of it and really see the most progress for your system and your organization. And so that's something that I just always like to keep in mind when we start this journey, whether we're starting from the beginning or from someone who's already relatively far along. We know it's going to take hard work, but we know that as long as we do it in a sensible way, we're going to see benefits from that. And so now we've got about 10 or so minutes available for questions. So please don't hesitate to send those in through the chat, and we'll start going through and addressing those. And additionally, if there are any questions that we don't have a chance to answer as part of this session, my email is up there on the screen, so please don't hesitate to send me an email with any further questions. Thank you.